Hey there, this is Paula from the Afford Anything podcast, and the interview that you are about to hear is special bonus material that I recorded live on stereo. So if you want to hear my special live stereo interviews, head to stereo.com/Paula Pant, download the app, follow me there, and you can listen to these interviews live. Now, with that said, on to the show. Hello?
Is this the Paula Pant?
Hello.
It is the Paula Pant. Is this the Mindy Jenson?
It is the Mindy Jenson and joined by the Scott Trench.
Hello.
The
How's it going?
Scott Trench. How are you?
Doing great. How are you?
I'm excellent. Thank you both for joining me on this brand new platform. Tell me about what the two of you are working on. What's your latest project and your latest area of interest in the world of real estate, particularly in the weird world of real estate in 2021?
Yeah, well, we've been working on, we think that there's a lot of people out there who are looking to make their first home purchase, and that there's kind of a little bit of a shift going on where folks are a little more wary of like buying the most expensive home, especially when prices are so high with all this kind of stuff. Maybe it won't be my forever home. Is there a better way? Is there a way to make like a smarter first time home decision than just kind of like buying a nice place that I love in a nice neighborhood? And so that's been our current project is working on solving that problem for folks.
Right. Before we get into the solutions, let's talk a little bit more about the problem. Is this something that you've been hearing for a while, and do you think that the conditions of the pandemic and now 2021 have exacerbated it?
The problem of people not wanting to overpay has kind of always been around. Last year when the pandemic first came out, it was, what am I going to do? I don't want to buy a house. Maybe I need to hold off. What's going to happen? Maybe there's going to be a 2008 crash again. So there was, in March and April, there was a lot of very little home buying going on. And then it started picking up again because rates dropped. This year, starting in about February, end of January, February, March, has been absolutely bonkers. It has been very little inventory, houses coming on the market, going under contract instantly for over asking. People are waiving their inspections. They're offering to cover the gap between what the home appraises at and what they offered on the property, if any. And it's just a really, really difficult time to make a smart, intelligent, well thought out decision, as opposed to a frantic, emotional, oh my God, I'm going to miss out on this house, I have to have it decision.
Yeah. And I'll add on to that with that, for most people, housing is about a third to 40% of their overall spending. And so it's the biggest decision they make, whether they buy or rent. And I believe that in general, that the decision you make on housing, if you buy at like the top of your range using all your cash and assuming the biggest payment you can qualify for, that really prevents your ability to build wealth in other areas like investing in stocks or retirement accounts or in real estate assets or those types of things, because you have no cash and you have no cash flow after you make that purchase. And so I think that's always been a challenge that people are maybe not able to articulate all the time, but are kind of becoming more and more aware of on a general level. And so how do we get around that? How do we make a decision that is less restrictive over the next 5-10 years? I think that's a question that is being asked more and more.
Do you think, within the past year, more people are working remotely, which means that people who previously lived in high cost of living areas now have the flexibility, or some do, have the flexibility to live in low cost or mid cost areas? Has that helped the situation of, people spending less than 35 to 40% of their income on housing, or specifically a lower percentage of their take-home pay on housing?
I think that from a general level, folks are more and more able, and especially with the pandemic, probably, you hypothesize over the next couple of years, you can live wherever you want to live to do many jobs. And I am interested, that's one hypothesis. I'm going to move out of San Francisco and into the Midwest because, housing costs are lower there. But, we're like Denver, Mindy and I live near Denver. And we think it's just one of the best places to live in general. And so it's not very cheap here, but people keep moving here because it's a great place to live. And if you're trying to be an entrepreneur and build a gigantic tech company, San Francisco is probably still going to be the best city to do that in, for the most part. Or, that's maybe arguable, but in general, I wonder if that will actually have that impact on housing prices that we think. I think a more relevant dynamic that's going on in recent years to the housing decision that we're talking about is the fact that folks are likely to move more frequently nowadays than they used to. You're probably going to get a job in multiple cities in many careers in technology or finance and those types of things. And so if your career used to be, I'm going to spend 30 years at the same company in the same town or a handful of companies in the same town, maybe now you're going to spend 5 years in one city, 7 years in the next, 6 years in the one after that. And so I think that's also a big component because people are planning to live in one spot for less time. But that would be my hypothesis. I don't have numbers to back all of that up, but that's how I'm seeing the world right now.
I'm glad you said that because my working hypothesis is also that the quote unquote death of cities is very overblown, and that if we look historically at what has happened to cities in past pandemics, basically every pandemic throughout history, people have always predicted the death of cities because people during a pandemic don't want to be in a densely populated area. And then once it's safe again, cities have always come roaring back because human nature is to be around other humans. And cities enable that. Yeah.
Yes. And was it James Altucher who said that New York City was going to not be the same after the pandemic was over? And I'm still seeing people living in big cities. There are always going to be people who want to live in big cities, and there are always going to be people who don't. And, I'm seeing a lot of people who did live in big cities want to spread out because their kids are home, they have to work at home, and their 2-bedroom condo doesn't work anymore for their current lifestyle. But I do think that people will move back to the cities as the pandemic lifts.
Right. Yeah, I agree. So what are some tips then? I mean, so given the fact that home prices nationwide are rising based on fundamental supply demand factors, right? There's low inventory. And at least in the short term, it looks like it's going to be that way for a while, right? There's not a ton of new construction permits. There's not a lot of new housing starts. The cost of lumber is insanely expensive because of some of the upstream supply chain pressures. Given the fact that home prices are high and are continuing to climb, and there's every indication that it will stay that way, how can a person avoid overpaying for a property? Or I shouldn't say overpaying, but how can a person manage the amount that they pay for a given property?
Yeah, well, first, I love the discussion on the supply prices. I think that the biggest, I agree with everything you said there. And I want to point out that perhaps the biggest lever overall is interest rates. The lower the interest rate, the payment, and the payment matters more than the price for most home buyers and most landlords. You get more cash flow on a lower payment, right? If it's a rent state. So when interest rates drop, the prices are going to rise significantly. And I've seen some interesting studies suggesting that, like Denver, for example, would be way overpriced at a 5% interest rate, but it might be underpriced, 3% interest rate still. And so that's an interesting kind of dynamic there that is a wild card or a bogey coming from the Federal Reserve and our government with a lot of those those types of decisions around controlling interest rates. So just know that can skew your analysis and throw out the best of predictions if that begins to change, for example, over the next year or so. Although all signs point low for a long time. So I just generally agree with everything you said there. I just know that that's a bogey that could trump some of the other types of things that we talked about, like supply and demand and all that kind of good stuff. Anyways, going back to your question, though, like how do I not overpay? Well, first, I think you have to understand fundamentally that buying a house is an expense, not an investment. It is going to you wealth to buy or to rent. And the more you buy or the more you rent, the less wealth you will have. And so framing the decision around that kind of helps you understand, okay, fundamentally, I need to buy the smallest or cheapest place that meets my needs and I'm going to be happy with. And that's going to be the best value for me. And then second, I think that if you agree with my premise that you're likely to move within 5 to 7 years and that things will change and all that kind of stuff will happen, then you need to think about exit options. What's going to happen for you in 4, 5, 6, 7 years or less, whenever you end up moving for whatever reason. You get a job in another city, family circumstances change, you have different wants, needs, lifestyle options, all that kind of stuff. And so I think if you can think, hey, housing is an expense, and the less I buy, the better off I am. And what are my exit options? I think you're going to be in great shape. And those exit options are typically one of 3 things. You can live in the property for all the property. You can rent it out. And whether you sell the property at a gain or a loss is something that you can sort of control or you can influence. Whether you rent the property for a profit or whether it costs you money to rent out that property is also something you control at the point where you buy the property and what you do afterwards.
All right. I've got two follow-up questions. The first thing that I want to do is I want to emphasize, for the sake of people listening, I want to emphasize the point that you made, which I absolutely love, that buying a personal residence, buying a primary residence that you live in, is an expense, not an investment. I think this is a very, very important point. And I want to emphasize that for everybody listening, because one thing that I've noticed is that many people seem to believe people are often surprised when I express the idea that your primary residence is not an investment, it's an expense. And the reason people are surprised, I think, is because many people perceive real estate to almost be like a sports team. You're for it or you're against it. And so they hear people like Ramit Sethi, who is a popular name in the personal finance space. They hear him say, oh, your housing is an expense, meaning your personal residence is an expense. And then they almost cast this dichotomy where they're like, well, you've got people like Ramit who are anti-real estate, and then you've got people like the BiggerPockets crowd and Paula Pant who are pro-real estate. And so which side are you on? And the point that I want to emphasize is we're all in agreement. Like, we're all saying exactly the same thing. Your primary residence is an expense, and then investment properties are investments, but the two should not be conflated with one another. They're very conceptually very different things, even though the underlying asset is a house. The use of that house, the purpose of that house is the differentiator. So that's not a question. That's just me talking.
Absolutely. I just want to add on to that one of the things that people forget about when they buy the house is closing costs, right? I have to pay 1 to 2% in buyer closing costs when I buy the property, and to sell the property, I often pay 6, 7, 8% in closing costs to sell the property. That includes listing and buyer agent commissions, title, inspections, appraisals across both those buyer and seller closing cost spectrum. So on a $400,000 property purchase, 2% or $8,000, some of them might go towards buyer closing costs, and 8% or $32,000 might go towards seller closing costs. That means that if you put 10%, $40,000, you're out $40,000 if you turn around and sell the property tomorrow. And yes, over the years, you will benefit from appreciation and loan amortization as part of your mortgage payment, which on average is better than renting over a long period of time. But there's a break-even point there that I think people don't really think about when they buy real estate. You have to hold it for a long period of time. And by the way, it's only after a very long period of time that the house actually begins to build wealth for you in most circumstances because of this phenomenon. You're pouring in, $800,000 into the property between down payment, closing costs, mortgage payments over 30 years, and that kind of stuff, to be left with an $800,000 asset paid off at the end of 30 years, right? So it's not really an investment. There's a lot of other better ways to spend your money, although it can be less expensive than renting, so it's not to say that buying a house is a bad choice. It's just not an investment in the way I think about it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, and the closing costs, the high transaction costs of dancing in and out of real estate. Well, I mean, that can to jump to the second topic, that could influence your exit strategy. So let's talk about those exit strategies that you mentioned, because certainly if you're living in a primary residence and you then have a need to move out, maybe you're moving to a different city, or your family size changes or something happens such that you leave that primary residence. You mentioned a variety of exit strategies. Can you talk through how to think through the pros and cons of those different strategies? I mean, and of course, transaction costs are going to play into that.
Well, before we get into the exit strategies, I think there's these two concepts of what kind of house is available. There is either a starter house or a forever house. And those are the only two types of houses you can possibly buy. And there's actually quite a few houses in between the starter house and the forever house. And you can't see me making air quotes, but I'm making air quotes on that forever house because, like Scott said, you're going to move between now and 5 and 7 years from now. So that's not really forever. It's just the next period of time. So people who are looking at buying their house, I'm going to get a starter house and in 3 years I'm going to move. Okay, if that's your plan, then that starter house should either be something where you can force some appreciation to make it an investment, such as the live-in flip strategy that I do, where you buy a very unattractive home and put a lot of work into it to make it beautiful and then sell it. Or you can run the numbers before you buy the house and see if it'll even work as a rental, because these quote unquote starter houses make really good rentals, maybe. I mean, it's not going to make a really great rental if you're buying it for $500,000 and you can rent it out for $1,000 a month. But it would make a really great rental if you could buy it for $100,000 and rent it out for $1,200 a month. And there are markets that you can do that in. You might not live in that market. And if you don't live in that market, that's okay. It doesn't mean that necessarily buying a house is a bad idea, but it means that you need to be aware of what you're buying.
Yep.
Right.
And for that, again, the three exit options being live in the property happily ever after, sell the property, ideally for a profit, and rent it out, short-term or long-term, ideally for a profit. It's going to be hard to get the best house that meets every one of those criteria in the shortest amount of time. You're going to have to give up something there. But I think that too many people overweight option one, which is buying the property and live there happily ever after, praying it goes up in value quickly. That option, I think, is far too heavily overweighted. And the more true all three of those options are, the better. And that's not to say don't live somewhere you don't like. That is one of the three criteria. If you don't live somewhere you don't like, you're going to compress your timeline for wanting to get out of there, which will impact you financially, right? So you have to like the place. But it's how do I analyze the puts and takes of being happy living there, being able to force appreciation or benefit from appreciation, and being able to rent the place out for cash flow in the event that I were to move out. If you can have all three of those options early on, a year or two after you buy the property, you're going to have a much more flexible position to approach your life from than if you only do the first one, for example.
And one of the things that we really want to encourage people to think about is actually to think about it. I know a lot of people who say, I'm going to buy this house and, when I'm done with it, I'll just rent it out. Well, if you just rent it out, that's great. But what if your mortgage payment is $2,000 a month and you can rent it out for $1,500? That's not a good rental. You are paying $500 to have a rental on top of the repairs that you need to make, any hassles you're going to have with your tenants, et cetera, et cetera. You've bought yourself a job. I don't want to buy myself.
Property management. Yeah.
Lots of things that go into expenses. So, and you might want to buy that house and none of the numbers work out and you're still okay with buying that house. At least you've thought about it. But not every house makes a good rental.
Right, right, exactly. How much weight should a person give that at the time in which they're making that purchase? I mean, if a person is in a market or in a situation in which uh, that the Venn diagram of what they personally want versus what's going to make a good rental, like if there's not much intersection between those two circles, which one should they prioritize, and what should they think through as they're making that decision?
I think for me, that depends on the timeline you think you're gonna be living there. You think it's probably a 3 to 4 year. I believe that the break even point. I have a fancy Excel model for this, which is free for anyone to use. But that says, hey, if you assume 3.5% appreciation and a couple of other things, that the break even point in many markets is probably at some point between 5 and 7 years, between where buying a home is a less expensive option than renting if you're going to live in it for more than 5 to 7 years on average. So I think your timeline is the first part of that. If you're going to live in there for a short period of time, buy a place that makes sense as a rental if you're going to keep it, or buy a place that you can force a bunch of appreciation so you can sell it in 2 or 3 years at a profit from there. If you're going to live in the place for a long or rent, right? So I did this analysis and I decided to rent. Frankly, we're writing this book for first time home buyer, and I'm like, oh, man, my model says I should rent right now. I'm renting in downtown Denver, and based on the things that I want for my lifestyle and how long I expect to be in the property and all that kind of stuff. So that's how I would kind of frame the thought process. If you're going to be there for 10, 20 years and this is your forever home and you know that for certain, then probably buying is almost certainly going to be better than renting, and get the place you want with that kind of stuff. Just know that the cost is that you're giving up a lot of those other options.
Yeah, I just want to highlight what Scott said. Scott Trench, real estate investor, CEO of BiggerPockets, and author of First Time Homebuyer, is choosing to rent because that's a smarter financial choice for him. And there's this myth, or what is it, the American dream, you have to buy a house. You don't have to buy a house. But if you are going to buy a house, this is a multi-hundreds of thousands of dollars purchase that you're making. Be prepared, be ready, be armed with all of the information that you could possibly need to make a smart, a well thought out decision, as opposed to the emotional and frantic decision that I'm seeing so many people make right now.
So I'm glad you said the emotional and frantic. That's a feeling that I think comes up a lot this year among home buyers who, they make an offer or two and then they realize that everything that they like is getting, going under contract on the day that it's put on the market at or above asking price, and it creates that feeling of FOMO, which leads to leads to that panicked, frantic, I've got to get something before I miss out feeling. What should a person do if they are going through the home buying process and they realize that feeling is coming up for them? How can they manage that?
Great. So when I think about the home buying process, I think about 3 broad strokes, key decisions, right? One is the strategy, right? That's fundamentally understand what we just talked about, fundamentally understanding that housing is an expense. The more you buy, the less well off you are. The second is thinking about the exit strategies, right? And I think that going through that exercise and really framing out what you're comfortable with and what the ramifications of those are, I think that's a $100,000 decision easily for many people, maybe several $100,000, maybe more. So the next phase down from that, step 2, is getting a good deal, right? And that's a $25,000 to $50,000 decision, perhaps, right? That, getting that good deal relative to the competition. And then the third step is kind of like the negotiation transaction process. Should I have the seller replace the water heater that's 15 years old? That's the $2,000 decision inside of the process. So what you're asking about is that second piece, if you agree with my framework around how do I get a good deal? How do I begin the transaction phase? And for this, I have a 3-minute rant. You ready for this?
Yeah, let's hear it.
All right. So there's a couple of steps here that I think you need to make in order to get a good deal in a market like we've got right now. First is get crystal clear, right? And that's understanding your exit strategies, framing out where you want to go. and maybe getting like 2 paragraphs onto a piece of paper. I want a 3-bed, 2-bath, 2,000 square foot home in Denver with a yard out back for the dog, a 2-car garage, 1950s build or later. I'm going to pay a little bit more on the edge of this neighborhood. I'm going to pay a little bit less on the edge of that neighborhood for these reasons. It's going to be this far away from my commute. These 4 or 5 neighborhoods and those edges are the ones that I want, right? And that's not 2 hours. It's not 200 hours of work to come up with that, but it's 25 hours of work, right? You got to spend time thinking about it, driving a couple of neighborhoods and really framing this out. And you should. This is the biggest financial decision of your life for most people who are doing that, right? So again, not 200 hours, but probably 20, a couple dozen hours to really think this out and get to that point. Once I've determined what I want, the first thing most people do is they pull up Zillow or the MLS, and they look and they say, here are all the active listings in my neighborhood. And because properties are going very quickly, when you pull up the active listings, you're seeing properties that are way overpriced. Those are the ones that are sitting on the market. You're seeing the 1 or 2 properties that happen to be reasonably priced or accurately priced, which go tomorrow, are gone before you have a chance to do anything with them. And you see the properties that have something horribly, horribly wrong with them. And so you get terrified of the market and you begin thinking you have to make a rash decision. A better way to frame it is don't even look at the active listings at first. Look at what's actually sold. Look what's actually sold 90 to 180 days and condense your list. Refine what you want and what's active until you're sure that you're not living in fantasy land. You're not wanting the $400,000 mansion in downtown because it doesn't exist anymore. You want that you know what you want and that it exists because it has sold 10 times in the last 180 days. Now, the next step that folks run into here is they'll set themselves up with an artificial timeline. I'm moving to a new city, therefore I have to buy before this date. Or my lease expires on June 30th, therefore I have to buy before June 30th, right? Get out of that. You're making a $400,000, $500,000 decision or whatever it is in your area. Pay your landlord an extra $100 or $200 or $300 a month and go month to month so that you can make your search from a position of strength. That's $1,000. If it's $300 a month, that's $1,200 over 4 months. That allows you to make that much better of a decision on your $400,000 purchase. I think you can make a 0.25% better decision by making a cool, calm, and collected thing from a fishing standpoint rather than a frantic, I'm going to offer at the last minute situation. I think so. So the next, and so from there, you set yourself up to say, I'm going to go fishing and I know what I want. I know that there's 10 properties that have sold in the last 180 days in my local market. That's 1 property every 18 days or 1 property every 2.5 weeks. Sometimes it'll be longer. Sometimes it'll be less long. I know what's the correct price on those. I'm willing to lose a few of them because I know that there's always going to be another one if my research is accurate. So now I can go fishing, I can set up my finances, and when the property comes on the market, I'm not making an instantaneous decision. I've made a decision over the course of 25 hours. That's very cool, very calmly collected, and very well researched. I just happen to be offering on that property instantaneously when it comes on the market, something I knew was going to happen based on my research. And so that, I think, is the way that you get a good deal today, or at least a fair deal in a market like today.
And I'd like to add that you don't fall in love with a property, because as awesome as it is to find the house that has everything, there's a lot of other houses that are just as good. And when you walk into a house and you fall in love with the property, I have to have it. Oh my goodness, I'm going to make an offer. This is going to be the best house. My whole life is going to be complete, filled with unicorns and rainbows because I found the one property on the planet that is perfect. And that there's not one property on the planet that is perfect. There are a lot of properties on the planet that will be just as perfect for you. So be prepared to make an intelligent offer based on what you feel it's worth, what you feel you can afford after you've done all the intelligent thought processes that Scott described, and then make the offer, sit back and wait. And you might lose. You're probably going to lose a couple of offers, and that's okay because there's more than one house for sale.
Absolutely. So yeah, I love everything that you've just said. I want to highlight a few points. One is I love the, and I tell my students this all the time, not looking at the active listings on Zillow or Trulia or Redfin or any of the public facing websites that pull data from the MLS, because It is a skewed and partial and incomplete list, and it will terrify you. And oftentimes the better data comes from looking at what has recently sold, or, for in a rental context, looking at what's currently available for rent and then checking back a week later to see how many of those are still on the market. That tells you something just about the neighborhood in general. How many people are moving into the area, how desirable a given area is. So yeah, I just wanted to echo that I really like the strategy of not looking at active listings on Zillow.
Yeah, I think that's a huge key.
Yeah. To your next point, the next point that you made, which is, don't have external time constraints such as you have to, move by the end of your lease, like pay your landlord extra to go month to month. That solves the problem of not feeling a sense of panic that's based on external time constraints. What should you do, however, if you still, you're paying your month to month on your current lease, so you don't have that external pressure to move quickly, but you're still feeling that internal panic from, from having narrowed your search to a limited geographic area, and then only seeing one property in that area come up every 10 days. And then, how do you deal with, I guess, the internal panic that comes up as you continue the hard slog of waiting?
I would have an open dialogue with your landlord and let them know that you're looking for a house and you're seeing them, every 10 days or so, and ask, how long can I have this month to month lease? Or do I have to have, I signed a 3-month lease. Can I make it a 4-month lease? Landlords really want to work with great tenants. But ultimately, you're just going to have to accept the fact that you did the research. It is one every 10 days or one every 2 weeks on average is coming up, and be prepared to act quickly when it does come up. You know what it's worth based on what you're seeing that has sold. You're making great offers. You're calling your agent and having your agent write up an offer as, you're seeing it that day that it comes on the market. You're writing up an offer that night. You already are pre-approved. You're ready to go. You've got your earnest money check already made out, and you can show the listing agent that you're ready to rock. But it might take time. And
yeah, I just think, like, on this, you're asking about the panic and stuff, like that is the normal buyer. Like if you like the strategy I have, and I like to think that will make a lot of that panic go away, because like why would you be panicked? Whether or not what you want exists. You're in no rush to buy because you can just keep renting, slightly higher price and all that kind of stuff, and you're ready to react. So I think that the whole point of that system I just outlined is to avoid exactly this state,
right?
Having panic.
I think the source of a lot of that, at least in talking to my students, I think the source of a lot of that comes from waiting, and then during that wait, watching prices continue to rise. Like if you're in a hot market like we're in right now, and you've been patiently watching the market for 3 or 4 months, and you've noticed that the market right now is a lot higher than where it was 4 months ago. And you're very aware of that because you followed the strategy that you've just outlined. You're watching very closely. You're a very well-educated prospective buyer. From talking to my students, a lot of them, like, they start the process very cool, very collected. But then once they're 3 or 4 months in and they still haven't bought anything, and they're noticing that the prices in their preferred area are now higher, it seems like a sense of FOMO sets in, and once FOMO sets in, then that's when people start making emotionally charged decisions.
Yeah, I'm a licensed agent in Colorado, and I have been seeing near the end of January, all of February, all of March, this frantic pace. I've never seen a market this hot in my whole life. And I've been investing for a very long time. I am now, just in the last couple of weeks, I'm starting to see more properties falling out of contract. And I'm nosy. I will send a note to the listing agent. Hey, why is this not under market yet? Why did this pop out of contract? And they'll say the buyer got cold feet, or the buyer asked the seller to make repairs, even though it's noted as is, and the seller didn't want to make any. And I'm seeing a lot of properties like this that weren't like this 2 months ago. So as a listing agent, I get a backup offer. If there's another offer out there, I will take it as the backup so I don't have to put it back on the market. Right now in the market, you can go back on the market and probably get close to what you were originally under contract for, but put up a backup offer. Have your agent contact the listing agent. We really like this house. We'd love to buy it, but we didn't get chosen. How can we be the backup offer? Your listing agent is going to be pretty open with you. Hey, you need to match the offer, or we will put you in the backup position. Or, I think there's a lot of agents out there that are afraid to ask questions of the listing agent. I don't really care what the listing agent thinks of me. They can think I'm dumb as long as they want, but I'm going to ask all the questions I can for my clients so that we have the most opportunity to buy a house.
Yeah, and just back to the FOMO thing there as well. Mindy has some great points there, but I would also just pop back out and talk about your strategy, framework, and approach to life, right? I mean, at that level with this, right? Like, you buy a house when your financial position is in the right position. You've got reserves, you've got good credit, stable income, and you framed out, you understand that it's an expense. You've made a calculated rent versus buy decision. You're thinking about your exit options and all that kind of stuff. And then you make your decision based on that framework. And from a position of strength where you have all the cards and you have all the time in the world to make the decision, that helps you avoid the kind of FOMO stuff. Like, you can have FOMO about Bitcoin, you can have FOMO about NFTs, you can have FOMO about buying a first. But the reason you have that FOMO is because you don't have a framework or philosophy about how to handle your money popped out, zoomed out over a 10, 30-year time horizon, I think. And so I think I would almost go way back to the beginning of that and say, like, where do I want my life to be in 10 years? What's my 30-year investment and money management philosophy and lifestyle goals there? How do I back in from there and get to something that makes a good decision in the short run? If prices go up 6% in the meantime, do I really care 30 years from now? That doesn't affect my strategy at all. With that, it says, the only thing that affects my strategy is if I go bankrupt in the meantime, right? So I can't have that happen. Got to capitalize it correctly and make sure that happens. But if I'm investing from a position of strength or buying my home from a position of strength in the world, I think that will help with the FOMO problem, because you're just making a decision. If no good decisions are able to be made in the short run, you reset your search and iterate on what you want, and whether that's realistic thing that we did earlier by looking at the sold listings. And if 6 months is too long, 180 days, because the market's really changed that much in 4 months, you reset your timeline to 45 days or 90 days, and you just keep iterating. Right.
And what I like about that answer is that it fundamentally starts with the end in mind. What ultimately are we trying to achieve? Like, we begin with that vision and then reverse engineer how to get there. Right. Excellent. Well, those are all the questions that I have for you. Is there anything that you feel that we've missed, or anything that you'd like to emphasize?
This market will not last. The market will have more properties. I mean, think about it. If you are a homeowner and you're seeing that your neighbor, who you thought could sell their house maybe for $500,000, they listed it for $575,000 and you thought he was crazy, and then he ended up selling it for $650,000. Oh, maybe I'm going to sell my house too. I think there are a lot of people who are sitting on the sidelines waiting to list their house because they don't have any place that they can buy right now. But they will, the market will even out. It cannot continue at this pace.
and Mindy and I respectfully disagree on this one, where I'll kind of take the opposite stance here, and I believe that, Paula, for many of the reasons you mentioned, that there's a lot of supply constraints here. There's not a lot of labor building construction. There's not a lot of lumber prices and raw materials are through the roof. There are constraints in many of the most popular areas like Denver. We got a lot of land around Denver. We don't have any water, right? And so places have land constraints or government constraints on housing supply, and more people want to buy houses right now. I think you got a lot of millennials are buying houses later in life, but I think they're still buying. So and interest rates are low, and the Fed seems to think that they're going to stay low. So I'm a little more skeptical about whether the market, the end of the current state, is actually as close as Mindy thinks it is, but we'll see.
Well, I don't think it's going to change tomorrow, but I think it cannot continue the way that it is.
Right. Now, to clarify your positions, and especially you, Mindy, I understand you don't think that it will continue at the current pace of growth. Do you think it will backtrack? Do you think prices will ever be lower than they are now? In other words, will it crash, or will it simply not grow as quickly?
I don't think we will see a 2008 level crash. I think that we will probably have more of an evening out of prices. It's not sustainable right now.
Okay.
How much do you have to make to afford a $500,000 house? And I'm in Longmont, Colorado. No prices start in the twos unless they're in the low income housing, the income restricted housing neighborhood, or they're a condo. Every house in Longmont is starting in the threes, and I'm talking like 335, 350, unless it backs up to the train.
Yeah, and on that, I think that housing cost, like, people get all worked up about like median income to housing cost to determine whether markets are priced appropriately. If there's 100 of a good and 1,000 people who want that good the same, the 100 richest people determine the price of that good. It's not a median, right? And so when you're a market like Memphis with a median income of closer to 40,000, and a market like San Francisco with a median income of closer to 85,000, the cost to buy groceries and run your life is only slightly different. The price of goods in San Francisco, to run your life, it might be 35,000 in San Francisco, and it might be 25,000 in Memphis, right? All of the rest of your disposable income can go towards housing, which is why the median income, the median price is way higher for housing, even though the median income is only about double or something like that, right? So that's I think a phenomena that is underappreciated by some folks in thinking about this. And so to answer your question about whether we think the pace will continue or not, I believe that there will be a reversion over a 30-year period to the mean, which is about 3.5% annual appreciation. But that curve, that could be, if you can envision hyper growth in the short run and then a leveling out over the long term, that kind of is where I would guess, generally speaking, the shape of this would be, barring changes to interest rates or other types of things that can completely blow your hypothesis out of the water with that. But assuming that, I think builders will begin building more, and governments will have pressure to enable more permits to enable more housing opportunities and those types of things if the current prices continue to balloon. And I think you will kind of revert to that. Whether it dips below current prices or not, I think that's a challenge, right? The saying is, you don't wait to buy real estate, you buy real estate and wait, right?
Right.
So that's kind of what I do. I just, every couple of years, you buy another one, and it was terrifying. We had the same conversation about how terrifying and overpriced the market was in 2014 when I bought my first place. So.
Yeah, exactly. exactly. So what's interesting to me about both of your answers is that, if I'm hearing you correctly, Mindy, you seem to indicate that you think it will stabilize. Scott, you think that we will have hyper growth, eventually followed by stabilization. Over the 30-year time period, there will be a reversion to the mean. But in the short term, we'll say in the next 1 to 3 years, Mindy, you're seeing stabilization. Scott, we'll even say 1 to 2 years. Mindy, you're seeing stabilization. Scott, you're seeing hyper growth. But what's interesting to me is that, if I'm understanding this correctly, neither of you see see it. Neither of you see a crash. Neither of you see a reason to sit on the sidelines and wait and not buy a property with the hopes that prices in the future will be cheaper, significantly cheaper than they are today.
Yeah, let me just kind of caveat this. I'm not necessarily predicting that. I don't know. That would be my best guess as to where I think things could go, but I am not making bets according to whether I think there will be a hypergrowth or whatever. I'm not pretending I can predict, or anyone can predict, what's going to happen into the market in the short run. I would, if you're asking me to have fun with the guess, that would be my guess about how things are going to. Another year or two of big growth, maybe 11. Like I saw something that said like 11% growth this year, and then maybe 6% the next year. Some sort of pattern like that. I don't know. Right. My strategy though says if the market goes down, I buy another one. If the market goes up, I buy another one. If the market stays flat, I buy another one, right? For my real estate approach. And great, if it goes down, I buy at a better price. And in 30 years, I'm going to see reversion to the mean of 3.5% appreciation, and I'll buy one cheaper if the market crashes next year. Because I plan to hold all these properties and capitalize them appropriately and conservatively, never going bankrupt, and just kind of hold them for a long period of time, expecting that long-term appreciation rate. So if the appreciation rate is greater, great, I make a little bit more money this year. If it's flat, great, I cash flow and pay down my mortgage and buy another one. So that's kind of how I approach it from a philosophical standpoint, without depending on these market forecasts to make any of my decisions.
Right, exactly. Yeah, there's a distinction between forecasting and projecting. Forecasts are very specific, whereas just a projection of what may happen in the future is a bit more generalized.
Yeah.
Right.
When are we going to say that the housing crash kind of stopped? It was started in 2008. Did it bottom out in like 2010, 11, 12? I moved to Colorado in 2012, and housing prices were flat, I think, here, and have been going up since. That's 9 years. And I've been hearing people predicting a crash for 9 years. Oh, I'm just going to wait because the market's going to change. Well, you should have bought in 2013 and 14 and 15 and 16 and 17 and 18 and 19 and 20 because prices are higher now. So it's, I don't think there's going to be a 2008 level crash again. That was a special set of circumstances.
Right. Exactly. Great. Well, thank you so much, both of you.
Yeah, thank you for having us and letting us spend another couple extra minutes here ranting about the market. We appreciate it. So I had fun.
This is fantastic. Where should people go if they want to find your book and if they want to know more about you and your work?
Yeah, you can find the book at biggerpockets.com/FTHB. You can also just type in first time homebuyer book into Google and find the book wherever books are sold. And then you can find Mindy and I on BiggerPockets. And I'm on Instagram at Scott_Trench.
And I'm on Twitter at Mindy@BP.
Awesome. Excellent. Well, thank you so much.
Paula, it's always lovely to talk to you.
Yes, always excellent to talk to you as well. And yes, and we'll get together. We'll chat soon about real estate, and we'll chat again soon about real estate and 2021 and everything that unfolds from here.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Will you both be at FinCon this year?
I will be.
I'm a maybe. I'm still thinking about it. See if it will work with the schedule and all that kind of good stuff.
Okay, great. Cool. Excellent. All right. Well, I'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Bye, Paula. Thank you.
Bye, Paula.
All right. Bye.